You know a great deal. You have read widely, thought carefully, developed a sophisticated understanding of many things: philosophy, psychology, the patterns of human behavior, the mechanisms of the mind. You can describe your own patterns with clinical precision. You know the frameworks, you have done the work. And the self-knowledge has not changed the self as much as the acquiring of it promised. The pattern you identified 3 years ago is still present. The habit you diagnosed with such accuracy is still running. The understanding of why you react as you do has not reliably prevented the reaction. The map of the inner life has become very detailed. The territory has remained, in the parts that matter most, largely unchanged. Thomas à Kempis, the 15th century Augustinian monk who wrote what has been called, after the Bible, the most widely read book in the history of Western Christianity, said something about this that is either deeply uncomfortable or deeply liberating, depending on what you are willing to hear. He said, "What does it profit you to enter into deep discussion about the Holy Trinity if you lack humility? What good is a deep knowledge of many things if you lack grace and displease the divine? Better surely is a humble peasant who serves God than a philosopher who observes the stars and neglects the knowledge of himself." He was not anti-intellectual. He was a monk of the Devotio Moderna, the new devotion, a movement that produced some of the finest manuscript illuminations and most rigorous theological scholarship of the late medieval period. He copied manuscripts for decades. He spent his life in study. But he had identified, with the specific precision of a person who had spent 70 years in close observation of the human mind's relationship to its own spiritual development, the particular way that knowledge can become a substitute for the thing knowledge is supposed to serve. And he was not willing to let it pass without saying so. There is a particular sophistication trap that the examined life produces. The trap of the person who has become very skilled at the examination and less skilled at the living, who can describe their dysfunction with such accuracy that the description itself has become a form of management, a way of relating to the problem from a safe analytical distance without being required to actually do the harder thing the problem is asking for, who has confused the map with the territory so thoroughly that the quality and detail of the map has become a substitute for the actual journey. Thomas à Kempis saw this in the scholarly culture of his time, the late medieval university world, in which theological argument had become an end in itself, in which the demonstration of learning had displaced the practice of the virtues the learning was supposed to produce. The man who could discourse at length on the nature of the Trinity and whose daily life showed no evidence of having been transformed by the understanding. The philosopher whose knowledge of the stars was impeccable and whose knowledge of his own heart was, by the evidence of his behavior, non-existent. He did not dismiss the value of learning. He dismissed the confusion of learning with the thing learning is for. And he proposed, in the Imitation of Christ, 4 books of dense, practical, occasionally severe, consistently honest instruction on the interior life, that the only knowledge that ultimately matters is the knowledge that changes the person who has it, the knowledge that has descended from the head into the heart, that has become not a set of propositions one holds, but a way one lives. He called this true knowledge. And he was specific about how to recognize the difference. The person who has true knowledge is humbler as a result of it, not more confident. Because genuine self-knowledge, in his precise and non-sentimental view, produces primarily the recognition of how far one is from the person one is trying to become. Not as self-condemnation, as the honest baseline from which genuine progress is possible. Thomas Hemmerkin was born around 1380 in Kempen, a town in what is now Germany, hence the name à Kempis of Kempen. He entered the monastery of Mount St. Agnes near Zwolle in the Low Countries at approximately 20 years old and remained there, with one brief interruption, for the rest of his extraordinary long life.
He died in 1471 at approximately 90 years old, having spent 70 years in the same monastery, copying manuscripts, teaching novices, writing, and practicing the interior life that the Imitation of Christ describes. He copied the Bible 4 times by hand. He copied a substantial portion of the patristic literature available to him. He was one of the most skilled manuscript copyists of his generation, and he spent decades absorbing, through the physical, meditative, attention-demanding practice of copying, texts that most scholars encountered only through reading. The difference, in his understanding, was significant. Reading can be done at speed and at distance. Copying requires dwelling, the slow, physical, word-by-word engagement with the text that produces a different quality of understanding than the intellectual overview. The Imitation of Christ was written in 4 books, probably between 1420 and 1427, when Thomas was in his 40s. The book circulated in manuscript, was copied by thousands of hands across Europe, and was among the first books printed after Gutenberg's press made printing possible. It has been in continuous circulation for 600 years. It has been translated into more languages than any book except the Bible. It has been read by More and Erasmus, by Ignatius of Loyola, who carried it on his travels, by Thomas More, by Dag Hammarskjöld, by John Wesley. It is not a book about theology in the doctrinal sense. It is a book about the specific, daily, unglamorous, continuously demanding practice of the interior life, the life organized around genuine self-knowledge, genuine humility, genuine attention to what the soul requires and what the soul's tendency towards self-deception keeps covering. It is, in his own words, a book for those who wish to understand what they read, not merely to know it. 3 ideas from the Imitation of Christ that constitute the Thomas à Kempis philosophy of genuine self-knowledge. The first is the vanity of learning without humility. The first sentence of the Imitation is the sentence that has stopped readers for 6 centuries. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, except to love God and serve Him alone. And he develops this in the opening pages into the specific charge against intellectual pride, the self-satisfaction of the person who has accumulated knowledge and mistaken the accumulation for the thing the knowledge was for. He is not saying knowledge is bad. He is saying knowledge without humility is dangerous in a specific way. It produces the illusion of having arrived at something when the thing the knowledge was pointing toward has not yet been reached. The person who knows many things and does not know themselves has all the tools and has not yet begun the actual work. And the actual work, the genuine, interior, costly daily work of self-knowledge and self-correction, is harder and less glamorous than the acquisition of knowledge, and it is what the knowledge was always for. The second idea is the discipline of self-examination. Thomas à Kempis is ruthlessly specific about what genuine self-knowledge requires. It requires the honest examination of the motives behind the actions that appear virtuous, the charity that is actually performed for social approval, the humility that is actually a form of self-promotion, the piety that is performed more fully when others are watching. This is the hard work, not the self-criticism that produces shame and paralysis, the honest, functional, applied examination of the gap between the appearance of virtue and the interior reality, the gap that the sophisticated self keeps knowing about and not closing. The person who has identified the pattern 3 times and not yet changed it has knowledge of the pattern, but not yet the knowledge that changes the pattern. The knowledge he is prescribing goes all the way down to the level at which the self-deception operates, not below the surface, to the level that the surface has been organized to protect. The third idea is the value of contempt for the world's opinion. Thomas à Kempis is direct about this in a way that most contemporary philosophy is not. The person who is organized around what others think of them cannot pursue genuine self-knowledge, because genuine self-knowledge will, at some point, reveal things that the maintenance of others' good opinion requires concealing. The person who needs to be seen as further along the path than they are cannot be honest about where they are. The need for approval organizes the self-examination around the conclusions that are approachable rather than around the conclusions that are accurate. He prescribes a specific counter-practice: care what God thinks. In secular terms, care what the honest, interior, completely private accounting reveals. Develop the capacity to receive negative self-knowledge without the social anxiety that usually accompanies it, because the social anxiety is what the self-deception is primarily serving. Now the bridge. Because Thomas à Kempis was a 15th century Augustinian monk writing within the specific framework of Catholic devotion and late medieval Christian spirituality. But here is what translates without any theological adjustment: the pattern you have identified and not changed, the self-knowledge that has become sophisticated without becoming transformative, the map of the interior life that is increasingly detailed and that corresponds, in the parts that matter most, to a territory you are not actually inhabiting differently than before the mapping began. Thomas à Kempis is not prescribing less self-examination. He is prescribing a different kind. Not the examination that produces accurate descriptions of the problem, the examination that goes all the way to the self-deception underneath the description, to the specific way the self organizes its understanding of itself around the conclusions that are comfortable rather than the conclusions that are accurate. The distinction is available. The person who reads this and feels vaguely recognized, who knows that there is a gap between the sophistication of their self-understanding and the actual change that the self-understanding has produced, is already in contact with what Thomas à Kempis is pointing at. The question is whether to stay in contact with it long enough to do something about it. Here is what Thomas à Kempis asks of you, practically, today. First, take the honest inventory of what the self-knowledge has not changed. Not what you have learned about yourself, what you have learned and that the learning has not changed. The pattern that you can describe in perfect detail and that is still present. The habit you have understood thoroughly and that is still running. The reaction you have analyzed comprehensively and that still arrives at the same speed. This is not failure. In Thomas's framework, it is the beginning of genuine self-knowledge, the honest recognition that the knowing has not yet descended from the head to the level at which it becomes transformative, the gap between the map and the territory, the place where the actual work of the interior life has not yet happened.
Second, examine one motive beneath the surface. Thomas à Kempis's most demanding specific practice. Take one action that you regard as virtuous or admirable, one practice, one commitment, one way of presenting yourself to others, and examine honestly and without the protection of the flattering interpretation what the motive actually is. Not what you would like the motive to be, what the interior evidence, observed carefully and without the defensive management, actually reveals. The charity that contains a trace of the desire to be seen as charitable, the humility that contains a trace of self-promotion, the intellectual honesty that contains a trace of the desire for the approval that intellectual honesty typically receives. Not to feel shame about what is found, to know it, because the motive that is known, even if it is unflattering, is a motive that the genuine interior work can address. The motive that is protected by the flattering self-interpretation continues to operate invisibly. Third, practice caring less about others' opinion of your progress. The specific practice that Thomas à Kempis prescribes for the person who has noticed that the social management of their spiritual appearance is interfering with their actual spiritual work. Not the performance of indifference to opinion, that is its own form of social performance. The genuine, daily, unglamorous cultivation of the interior accounting as the primary standard.
Where are you performing self-improvement for an audience? Where is the account of your development organized around the version that sounds best rather than the version that is most accurate? Where does the management of how you are perceived by others interfere with the honest assessment of where you actually are? Find one such place, and for today, care about the honest account more than the favorable one. Fourth, practice one small thing you actually know to be right. This is Thomas à Kempis's most practical and most humbling instruction. Not the acquisition of more knowledge, the practice of one thing you already know. The small action that the knowledge has been pointing toward and that the accumulation of more knowledge has been substituting for. The conversation you know to have. The apology you know to make. The habit you know to change, not by understanding it better, but by, on this one day, doing it differently. The test of genuine self-knowledge in his framework is not the sophistication of the description. It is the change in the behavior. The knowledge that has descended from the head into the heart expresses itself in action. The knowledge that has not yet made this descent produces accurate descriptions and unchanged behavior. The practice he prescribes is the most available possible. Take one thing you already know and do it today. I want to close with the image of Thomas à Kempis that stays with me, not the famous book, not the monastery or the decades of copying, the copying itself. The word-by-word, slow, meditative, physically demanding engagement with the text that he practiced for 70 years. Not reading, copying. The difference is the attention required. The reader can skim, the copyist cannot. The copyist must dwell, must remain present to each word before the hand can form it and move to the next, must encounter what is being copied at the speed of the hand rather than the speed of the eye. This is the practice he is prescribing for the interior life, not the reading of it, the copying. The slow, word-by-word, fully attentive engagement with the actual reality of the actual self that the faster, more comfortable intellectual overview is always sliding past. The dwelling required by genuine self-knowledge as opposed to the accumulation of accurate descriptions that the faster examination produces. To know many things and know nothing if you do not know yourself. Not a dismissal of knowledge, a prescription for the kind of knowledge that actually changes the knower. The copying rather than the reading. The slow descent from the head to the heart. The specific, available, entirely unglamorous daily practice of engaging the interior life at the speed that genuine understanding requires. He did this for 70 years in a monastery in the Low Countries. He produced, in those 70 years, the most read book in Western Christianity, and he would have said, with the specific, unpretentious, entirely genuine humility that is the Imitation's consistent tone, that the book itself was the reading, the copying was the life. Here is the question Thomas à Kempis leaves us with today. What do you know that has not yet changed you? What self-knowledge, accurate, sophisticated, carefully accumulated, has remained at the level of the map without yet becoming the territory? And what is the one small thing you already know that no additional understanding is required to know that you could simply do today, not because you have understood it newly, but because the understanding has been present long enough? Leave that in the comments, because naming the gap between the knowing and the living is the beginning of the work that Thomas à Kempis spent 70 years copying into his bones. Not more knowledge, the descent. The slow, humble, entirely available movement of the knowledge that is already there into the life that is already here. I'll see you in the next one.